Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. David's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, the rental car's headlights cutting through the darkness of the Forest Service road. 3 days. Emily had been missing for 3 days, and the search teams had found nothing but her abandoned backpack near the trail marker. The park rangers had called off the official search at sunset, but David couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. The radio crackled with static as he drove deeper into the Olympic National Park, cell towers a distant memory in this primordial wilderness. Emily had come here for her graduate research on old-growth ecosystems, excited about documenting trees that had stood for over 1,000 years. Now those same ancient giants loomed like silent sentinels in his headlights, their massive trunks disappearing into the black canopy above. He parked at the trailhead where her Honda had been found and stepped into the suffocating darkness. His flashlight beam seemed pathetically small against the vast wilderness, but he pushed forward along the narrow trail. Branches scraped against his jacket with sounds like fingernails on glass. The air hung thick with the smell of decomposing leaves and something else, something metallic that made his stomach clench. "Emily!" His voice echoed strangely among the trees, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive silence that followed. No birds sang, no insects chirped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath in this place. 20 minutes into the hike, he found the first marker. 3 deer skulls hung from a Douglas fir, arranged in a perfect triangle and bound with what looked like twisted grass. The bone was old, yellowed, but the grass appeared fresh. David's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't natural. This wasn't some Park Service educational display. The skulls faced outward like sentries, hollow sockets staring into the darkness with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. He photographed them with shaking hands, the camera flash illuminating the grotesque arrangement for a brief, startling moment. In that instant of light, he could have sworn he saw movement in his peripheral vision, something massive shifting between the trees. But when he swung his flashlight toward the spot, only shadows danced in the pale beam. The trail began to descend, winding deeper into a valley that seemed to swallow sound and light. David's hiking boots crunched on carpet of pine needles that felt too soft, too thick, as if the forest floor was hiding something beneath. Every few hundred yards he found more markers. Animal bones arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly, symbols carved into bark that seemed to shift when observed from different angles. Stone cairns that appeared ancient but felt freshly built. Someone, or something, was marking territory. The realization hit him like ice water in his veins. Emily hadn't just gotten lost. She had wandered into something's domain. The official search teams had missed these signs, or maybe they had found them and retreated without reporting what they'd seen. David pressed on, driven by a father's desperate love and growing dread. The trail split 3 ways at a grove of cedars so massive their trunks could have housed entire families. No trail markers indicated which path to take. David chose the middle route, following what appeared to be the most worn path. But after 100 yards, the trail seemed to fade entirely. He turned back, but the intersection looked different now. 5 paths instead of 3. The beam of his flashlight revealed fresh footprints in the soft earth. Bare feet, human-sized but with toes spread impossibly wide, as if adapted for gripping rough terrain. Emily's research notes had mentioned indigenous legends about the deep forest, stories of guardians that predated European settlement by millennia, territorial spirits that protected the old places from intrusion. David had dismissed them as folklore, but now, standing in this primeval darkness with those strange footprints leading deeper into the unknown, he began to understand that some legends grew from terrible truth. A sound drifted through the trees, rhythmic tapping, like wood striking wood. David followed it, his rational mind insisting it was just a woodpecker, but his gut knowing better. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, carrying an almost musical quality that made his teeth ache. It was coming from a clearing ahead, visible through a gap in the massive trunks. David crept forward and peered between the trees. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that defied easy description. Bones, human and animal both, formed a spiraling tower nearly 10 feet tall, held together with sinew and decorated with what appeared to be scalps and strips of clothing. Around its base, more bones were arranged in perfect concentric circles, creating a mandala of death that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The tapping came from a figure moving around the structure's perimeter. Tall and gaunt, covered in mud and plant matter, it struck the bone tower with a club made from a human femur. With each strike, the entire forest seemed to shudder, and David felt an overwhelming urge to run, to flee this place and never return. But hanging from the tower's peak, he saw a flash of red fabric. Emily's jacket, the one she'd been wearing in her last text message photo. The Guardian, for that's what it had to be, stopped tapping and turned toward David's hiding spot. Even in the darkness, David could see its eyes reflecting his flashlight beam like an animal's. But there was intelligence there, ancient and utterly hostile. It had been waiting for him. It knew he would come. The creature opened its mouth and spoke in a voice like grinding stone, words in a language that predated civilization. Though David couldn't understand the meaning, the intent was crystal clear. This is my domain. You are not welcome. Leave now, or join the others who feed my garden. David's hands moved to his phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen showed no signal. The device felt foreign in his hands, a piece of modern technology rendered useless in this primordial place. The Guardian began walking toward his hiding spot with movements that seemed to flow like water despite its towering frame. He ran. Branches tore at his face and clothes as he crashed through the underbrush, abandoning the trail entirely in his panic. Behind him came pursuit. Not the heavy footfalls he expected, but a sound like wind through leaves, as if the forest itself was chasing him. Trees groaned and shifted in his wake, their branches reaching like grasping fingers. Roots erupted from the earth to trip him, and thorny vines seemed to grow across his path in real time. David stumbled into another clearing and discovered he wasn't the first to flee this way. Scattered across the small space were the remains of other visitors. Backpacks, camping gear, fragments of clothing, and bones picked clean by carrion feeders. Some of the gear looked recent. A Park Service radio lay smashed against a tree trunk, its antenna twisted into the same spiral pattern he'd seen at the bone tower. He grabbed a hiking stick from the debris and pressed forward, no longer trying to retrace his steps, but simply seeking escape from this nightmare forest. The Guardian's presence pressed against his mind like a physical weight, filling him with primitive terror that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at his survival instincts. The trees began to thin, offering hope of escape, but as David reached what should have been the forest edge, he found himself back at the bone tower. The Guardian stood waiting for him, its mud-caked features arranged in what might have been a smile. It gestured toward the structure with one long arm, and David saw more red fabric among the bones. Not just Emily's jacket, but her jeans, her hiking boots, arranged like trophies among the skeletal remains. "Where is she?" David's voice cracked with exhaustion and terror. "What did you do with my daughter?" The Guardian pointed upward, and David's flashlight beam followed its gesture to the canopy above. There, suspended in a web of vines and branches 60 feet off the ground, hung a cocoon of leaves and bark. It was human-sized and moved slightly in the still air, as if something inside was breathing. Alive. Emily was alive. The knowledge should have brought relief, but instead, it filled David with fresh horror. The Guardian wasn't just killing intruders. It was keeping them, adding them to its collection, transforming them into something else. The creature spoke again in its grinding voice, and this time David understood. Not the words, but the meaning that bypassed language and spoke directly to his soul. She feeds the ancient trees now. Their roots drink her dreams. Soon she will be one with the forest, and it will be stronger for her sacrifice. You can join her, or you can leave and send others to feed the hunger of this place. David looked up at the swaying cocoon, knowing that Emily was trapped inside, probably unconscious, slowly being transformed into something that would serve the Guardian's purposes. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was impossible, that such things didn't exist in the modern world. But standing in this clearing, surrounded by evidence of the Guardian's territorial savagery, rationality felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. The Guardian began its tapping ritual again, each strike of bone against bone sending vibrations through the earth that David felt in his chest. The sound was calling something, summoning reinforcements from the deep forest. David could hear them now, movements in the darkness, the whisper of many feet approaching through the undergrowth. He had minutes, maybe less, before they arrived. The Guardian watched him with those terrible reflecting eyes, patient as stone, confident in its territorial dominance. It had played this game for centuries, outlasting explorers and settlers and tourists, adding their remains to its bone garden, feeding their essence to trees that remembered when the world was young. David gripped his improvised weapon and looked up at his daughter's prison, 60 feet of climbing through branches that would fight him every inch of the way, while the Guardian and its servants closed in. The odds were impossibly against him, but he was Emily's father. He had taught her to ride a bicycle, walked her to her first day of school, held her while she cried over her first broken heart. Some things mattered more than survival. The approaching sounds grew louder. David began to climb. The Guardian's bone club struck faster now, its rhythm urgent, commanding. The forest responded with violent motion, branches whipping like tentacles, bark becoming razor-sharp, sap flowing like blood from wounded trees. David climbed anyway, driven by love stronger than terror, reaching toward his daughter while ancient horror raged around him in the darkness between the trees. Behind him, the Guardian's servants emerged from the shadows, their eyes reflecting like stars in the night, ready to defend their master's domain against this desperate father who dared to challenge forces older than human memory. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in David's place? Derek Martinez pulled his SUV into the gravel parking lot of Blackstone National Forest at precisely 6:47 a.m., 15 minutes ahead of his calculated schedule. The missing person report for Emma Caldwell sat neatly organized in his passenger seat, timeline documented, last known coordinates plotted, witness statements cross-referenced. 23 years as a search and rescue coordinator had taught him that emotion clouded judgment. Logic saved lives. Emma had been missing for 36 hours. The initial search teams had combed the main trail system twice, finding nothing but her abandoned backpack at mile marker 7. Derek studied his topographical map one final time, red ink marking the search grid he'd methodically planned. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, but patterns existed in everything. People didn't simply vanish. He shouldered his pack and activated his GPS unit, watching the coordinates lock. The device showed his position clearly, 41.2847 degree N, 74.1931 degrees W. The main trailhead marker confirmed the reading. Everything aligned perfectly with his calculations. The morning air carried the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. Derek's boots crunched rhythmically on the gravel path as he began his systematic sweep of Sector 7, where Emma's backpack had been recovered. His handheld radio crackled to life every 15 minutes. Check-ins with base camp, all documented, all routine. At 8:15 a.m., Derek reached mile marker 7. He photographed the scene from multiple angles, noting the positioning of broken branches and disturbed undergrowth. Emma's backpack had been found here, but something about the scene felt wrong. Too clean, too organized. Missing persons didn't typically arrange their belongings so precisely before disappearing. Derek consulted his GPS again. The coordinates had shifted. The device now read 41.2851 degree N, 74.1928 degree W. Impossible. He hadn't moved from the marker. Electronic equipment malfunctioned in remote areas, but GPS satellites didn't spontaneously relocate. He reset the device and waited for reacquisition. The forest had grown quieter. The morning birdsong that had accompanied his hike had faded to nothing. Derek glanced at his watch. 8:18 a.m. Only 3 minutes had passed, but the quality of light filtering through the canopy seemed different. older somehow. Thicker. His radio hissed with static when he attempted his scheduled check-in. Base camp, this is Derek. Position report, mile marker 7, status normal. The response came back garbled, words bleeding together in electronic noise. He adjusted the frequency and tried again. More static. Derek pulled out his backup compass. The needle spun wildly before settling on what should have been northeast. But according to his map, northeast led deeper into uncharted forest, not back toward the trailhead. He held the compass steady, watching the needle quiver and shift. Magnetic interference from mineral deposits, he told himself. There were logical explanations for everything. The trail ahead looked different than it had on his approach, wider somehow. The undergrowth pressed closer to the path, and the trees seemed taller, their branches interweaving overhead like gnarled fingers. Derek checked his notes. He'd documented this exact section 30 minutes ago. The trail had been narrow then, barely wide enough for single-file hiking. He photographed the trail again, comparing the images on his camera's display. The new photos showed a completely different landscape than those taken earlier. Same timestamp, same coordinates according to his GPS, but the forest itself had changed. Derek stared at the images until his eyes watered, searching for some logical explanation. A sound echoed from somewhere ahead, a voice calling his name. Female. Young. It could be Emma. Emma, can you hear me? I'm Derek Martinez, search and rescue. His voice seemed to disappear into the trees without echo, swallowed by the dense air. The responding call came again, definitely female, but from a different direction now. Behind him. Derek spun around. The trail he'd just traveled looked foreign. The mile marker was gone. The gravel path had become dirt, then moss, then something that looked more like animal track than human trail. His GPS showed the same coordinates as before, but the landscape bore no resemblance to any terrain he'd mapped. He forced himself to breathe slowly, methodically. Panic killed. Logic saved lives. There had to be a rational explanation. Fog could create optical illusions. Low blood sugar could cause disorientation. He'd been hiking for over an hour without food. Derek opened his pack and pulled out an energy bar, checking his supplies. Everything was accounted for, organized exactly as he'd packed it. But the water bottles felt wrong in his hands, lighter than they should be, as if the liquid inside had partially evaporated. He unscrewed the cap on one bottle. It was full, but the water had an oily quality, refracting light in patterns that made his stomach turn. The voice called again, closer now. Derek, help me. This time he was certain. Emma's voice, distorted by distance and desperation. He followed the sound, abandoning his systematic search pattern for the first time in his career. The trail, if it could still be called a trail, wound between trees that seemed to shift position when he wasn't looking directly at them. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, but his peripheral vision caught constant movement, shadows rearranging themselves. His GPS unit beeped. New coordinates. 41.2847 degree N, 74.1931 degree in W. The exact position where he'd started that morning. But he'd been walking for over 2 hours, covering at least 3 miles of ground. The device had to be malfunctioning. Derek stopped and pulled out his paper map, orienting it with his compass. The needle pointed in a direction that didn't exist on the topographical survey. Northwest by north-northwest, an impossible bearing. When he looked up from the map, the trail had vanished entirely. He stood in a small clearing surrounded by identical trees, perfect circles of pine and oak, their trunks evenly spaced as if planted by some obsessive gardener. The ground beneath his feet was covered in fallen leaves that formed geometric patterns, spirals within spirals, fractals that hurt to look at directly. Emma's voice drifted from every direction at once. Derek, I'm lost. Can't find the way back. The sound reverberated off the trees, but there was no echo. Instead, the words seemed to multiply, layering over themselves until they became a chorus of Emmas, all crying for help, all lost, all calling his name with increasing desperation. Derek's radio crackled. Through the static, he heard his own voice reporting in from mile marker 7. Base camp, this is Derek. Position report, mile marker 7, status normal. But he was standing in the clearing. He hadn't touched his radio in over an hour. The transmission continued. His voice, his words, his scheduled check-ins playing back in order. 8:15 a.m., 8:30 a.m., 8:45 a.m. Each report identical, each confirming his position at mile marker 7. But the radio's timestamp showed 11:42 a.m. 3.5 hours had passed. Hours he couldn't account for. Derek examined his camera, scrolling through the photos he'd taken. Hundreds of images filled the memory card. The same trail from dozens of angles. The same trees photographed repeatedly. The same mile marker captured again and again. But he remembered taking only 7 pictures. In the final photo, a figure stood in the background. Small, distant, but unmistakably human. Emma wearing the bright red jacket described in the missing person report. She was looking directly at the camera, one hand raised as if waving. Derek looked up from the display. The clearing was empty. No footprints in the geometric leaves, no sign that anyone had ever stood there. But when he checked the photo again, Emma had moved closer. Still distant, but clearly approaching the camera's position. He scrolled to the next image. Closer still. Her face was visible now, pale and dirt-streaked, mouth open as if calling for help. But Derek hadn't taken another picture. The camera continued generating images on its own, each showing Emma's approach in perfect detail. Her eyes were wrong, too wide, reflecting light that didn't exist in the forest. Her movement was wrong too. Not quite walking, more like gliding across the ground without disturbing the leaves. In the final image, Emma stood directly in front of the camera, close enough to touch. Her mouth was open impossibly wide, and Derek realized she wasn't calling for help. She was screaming. The sound began then, not from his camera, but from the forest itself. A shriek that seemed to emerge from the trees, the ground, the air around him. The geometric leaves scattered in perfect spirals, revealing symbols carved into the earth beneath. Ancient markings that formed patterns his mind couldn't process without triggering waves of nausea. Derek ran. Logic abandoned him completely as he crashed through the identical trees, his carefully organized equipment scattering behind him. His GPS screamed coordinates that changed with every step. His compass spun like a roulette wheel. His radio played back conversations he'd never had with Emma, her voice begging him to find her, to save her, to join her in the place where lost things go. The trees reached for him with branches that had too many joints. The ground tilted at angles that defied gravity. Distance became meaningless. He could see the trailhead parking lot in the distance, but no matter how long he ran, it remained exactly the same distance away. Behind him, Emma's laughter echoed through the forest. Not the frightened girl from the missing person report, but something else wearing her voice. Something that had been waiting in the spaces between reality, in the gaps where logic failed and impossible things took root. Derek's systematic mind, trained to find patterns and solutions, finally understood the truth that would drive him mad. There was no pattern here, no solution, no logic that could save him. The forest had rules, but they were rules that human consciousness couldn't comprehend. Geometry that folded in on itself, time that moved in loops and spirals, space that rearranged itself when observed. Emma had been the bait. But for what? Derek could no longer remember. His training, his experience, his carefully documented procedures, all meaningless now. The forest had shown him that reality was far more fragile than he'd ever imagined. As the trees closed in around him, Derek's last rational thought was that his 23 years of search and rescue experience had been preparation for this moment. Not to save Emma, but to become another voice calling from the impossible spaces between what was real and what should never exist. The radio in his abandoned pack continued its scheduled check-ins. Derek's voice reporting his position at mile marker 7, status normal, forever and ever, echoing through a forest that existed in the spaces where maps couldn't reach and logic came to die. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Derek's place? Hope you felt genuine shivers. If you appreciate authentic horror, consider following. Which moment scared you the most? Ethan adjusted his GPS for the third time, cross-referencing the coordinates with the topographical map spread across his dashboard. The data was clear. Emma's last known location pinged from the north ridge of Blackwood National Forest, exactly 2.3 miles from the main trail. As a forensic data analyst for the state police, he approached missing person cases like complex algorithms, methodical, logical, solvable. The Forest Service ranger had been reluctant to let him venture alone into the backcountry, especially with storm clouds gathering overhead. But Emma Rodriguez had been missing for 72 hours, and the official search teams had found nothing. Ethan had spent the morning analyzing cell tower data, GPS breadcrumbs, and credit card transactions. The evidence formed a clear trail leading here, to this remote section of forest that most hikers avoided. He shouldered his backpack, checking his inventory one final time. Emergency beacon, first aid kit, water for 2 days, high-calorie rations, flashlight with extra batteries, and his tablet loaded with all available data on Emma's case. Everything logical, everything planned. The forest couldn't hide secrets from someone who understood data patterns. The trail started wide and well-maintained, marked with standard blazes every 100 yards. Ethan documented each waypoint, photographing trail markers and noting GPS coordinates in his field notebook. Emma's phone had last transmitted from approximately 47 minutes ahead at his current pace. He calculated arrival time, factoring in elevation gain and his physical conditioning. But 20 minutes into the hike, the blazes began to look wrong. Ethan stopped, consulting his map. The trail marker read North Ridge Trail, exactly as expected, but the metal placard appeared weathered beyond what made sense for a maintained Forest Service trail. The edges looked corroded, the letters partially obscured by what might have been rust stains. He photographed the sign from multiple angles, making notes about the discrepancy. The rational explanation was simple. Budget cuts meant less frequent maintenance. Government agencies often let infrastructure deteriorate longer than advisable. He'd seen it in countless datasets, deferred maintenance creating false anomalies in official records. As he continued climbing, the forest grew denser. The canopy thickened overhead, filtering the afternoon light into a dim, greenish twilight that made his watch difficult to read. According to his calculations, he should be approaching the location where Emma's phone had last communicated with the cellular network. That's when he found the first piece of her gear. A bright yellow stuff sack hung from a branch roughly 8 feet off the ground, far too high for someone to have accidentally dropped it. Ethan circled the tree, analyzing the placement. No scuff marks on the bark suggested climbing. No broken branches indicated someone had thrown the bag upward. It simply hung there, perfectly positioned, as if placed by someone tall enough to reach that height without effort. He photographed the scene from multiple angles before using a fallen branch to retrieve the bag. Inside, he found Emma's backup battery pack, her emergency whistle, and a small notebook filled with her handwriting. The entries were dated, starting from 3 days ago. Day 1, trail conditions excellent, weather holding. Should reach the falls by tomorrow afternoon. Day 1, evening. Something feels wrong about this place. Sounds don't carry right. My voice echoes back differently than it should. Day 2, lost the main trail. Compass reading doesn't match GPS. Following what looks like game trail heading northwest. Day 2, evening, found old campsite. Fire ring looks recent, but everything else feels ancient. Staying here tonight. Don't like the sounds after dark. The final entry was barely legible, the handwriting shaky and pressed deep into the paper. Day 3. It knows I'm here. Ethan felt his analytical mind engaging with the puzzle. Emma had been an experienced hiker, someone who understood navigation and wilderness safety. Her description of acoustic anomalies and compass variations suggested possible magnetic interference, perhaps mineral deposits or underground water systems affecting her instruments. The deteriorating handwriting indicated stress, dehydration, or injury affecting her motor control. All perfectly explainable, all within normal parameters for someone lost in unfamiliar terrain. But as he read her final entry again, something cold settled in his stomach that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. The trail beyond the tree became harder to follow. What had been a clear path now seemed to fragment into multiple smaller tracks. Game trails and erosion channels that branched and converged in patterns that defied the logical topology he'd studied on his maps. Ethan consulted his GPS repeatedly, but the device began showing inconsistent readings, sometimes placing him on the marked trail, sometimes indicating he was hundreds of yards from any mapped path. He photographed each waypoint, documenting the discrepancies between his equipment and his observations. The scientific method demanded careful data collection, especially when dealing with anomalous readings. Equipment failure was always more likely than environmental impossibilities, but the deeper he moved into the forest, the more his instruments seemed to disagree with reality. His compass began spinning slowly, never quite settling on a consistent direction. The GPS signal flickered between full strength and complete loss, sometimes showing his location jumping randomly across the map display. Even his watch, a reliable atomic timepiece, began showing minutes that felt too long, hours that passed too quickly. Emma's trail became more erratic. He found pieces of her gear scattered at impossible intervals, a water bottle hanging from a branch 12 feet overhead, her hiking pole driven point first into a tree trunk with enough force to embed it 6 inches deep, her spare socks laid out in a perfect grid pattern across a clearing, as if someone had arranged them with obsessive precision. Each discovery defied logical explanation, but Ethan's training demanded he continue collecting data. Pattern analysis required sufficient sample size. Anomalies became meaningful only when viewed in aggregate. The forest grew quiet around him, the normal sounds of wildlife fading until he walked through an almost perfect silence. His footsteps on the leaf litter seemed to echo strangely, as if the sound bounced off surfaces that weren't there. When he called Emma's name, his voice returned from directions that made no sense. Behind him when he faced an open clearing, above him in empty sky, below him from solid ground. Acoustic reflection, he told himself, speaking aloud to break the oppressive silence. Sound waves bouncing off rock formations or dense vegetation. But his voice echoed back wrong, distorted in ways that made his skin crawl. As afternoon faded toward evening, Ethan found Emma's campsite. The fire ring sat in the center of a small clearing, surrounded by her scattered gear arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Her tent had been erected perfectly, guy lines taut and rainfly properly positioned, but it faced directly into a wall of thorns that no rational person would choose as a view. Her sleeping bag lay spread beside the fire ring, positioned as if someone had been sleeping there moments before he arrived. The fabric still held an indentation in the shape of a human body, despite the fact that Emma had been missing for 3 days. Ethan approached slowly, his analytical mind struggling to process what he observed. The sleeping bag was dry, despite 2 nights of rain visible in the weather data. The fire ring contained fresh ashes that were still warm to the touch. Emma's remaining gear lay organized around the campsite with mathematical precision, each item placed exactly the same distance from the center point. Someone had been maintaining this campsite. Someone had been sleeping in Emma's sleeping bag using her gear, keeping her fire burning. But Emma was missing. Ethan began documenting everything with his camera, photographing the scene from multiple angles, measuring distances between objects, collecting samples of the ash for later analysis. The scientific approach would reveal rational explanations for what appeared to be impossible. That's when he noticed his photographs. The images on his camera's display showed the campsite, but not as he observed it. In the photographs, the gear appeared scattered randomly. The fire ring looked cold and filled with days-old ash, and the sleeping bag lay crumpled and rain-soaked against a fallen log. The pictures showed evidence of a campsite abandoned for days, not the organized, actively maintained site he could see with his own eyes. Ethan lowered the camera and looked at the campsite again. Fresh ashes, warm fire ring, perfectly organized gear. He raised the camera and took another photograph. The display showed abandonment and decay. His hands began to shake as he repeated the process, over and over, each time seeing the same discrepancy between reality and recorded image. His equipment was malfunctioning, or his perception was compromised, or something was interfering with normal cause and effect relationships in ways that violated every principle of rational analysis. "Equipment failure," he whispered, but his voice echoed back as laughter. Darkness fell with unnatural speed, the forest plunging from twilight to complete blackness in moments that felt too brief for natural sunset. Ethan activated his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the campsite. In the artificial illumination, everything appeared as his photographs had shown, abandoned, rain-soaked, cold. He turned off the flashlight. Moonlight revealed the organized campsite, warm ashes glowing softly in the fire ring. Light on, abandonment. Light off, active habitation. Ethan's analytical mind began to fracture as he clicked the flashlight on and off repeatedly, watching reality shift between states that couldn't coexist. His training demanded logical explanations, but logic had become meaningless in a place where observed phenomena contradicted documented evidence. A sound emerged from the darkness beyond the clearing. Footsteps approaching through the undergrowth, slow and deliberate, accompanied by something that might have been breathing but carried too much weight, too much presence, to come from human lungs. "Emma?" he called, though he knew with growing certainty that whatever approached in the darkness was not the missing hiker he'd come to find. The footsteps stopped just beyond the range of his flashlight beam. In the silence that followed, Ethan could hear something that defied description. A sound like whispers spoken by vocal cords that had forgotten how to form words, like sobbing filtered through lungs filled with earth, like laughter played backward through speakers buried underground. His flashlight beam began to flicker, the steady illumination becoming erratic, strobing between light and darkness in patterns that seemed almost like communication. Each flash revealed glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, shapes that vanished when he turned toward them, shadows that moved independently of their sources, eyes that reflected light from positions where no eyes should exist. "Equipment malfunction," Ethan said, but his voice broke on the words. In the strobing light, he saw Emma. She stood at the edge of the clearing, perfectly visible during each brief flash, wearing the same hiking clothes she'd worn in her missing person photograph. But something was fundamentally wrong with her presence, something that made his mind recoil from direct observation. She stood too still, breathed too regularly, smiled too widely. Her eyes reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's, but the light that bounced back carried colors that didn't exist in any spectrum Ethan understood. "I've been waiting for you," Emma said, and her voice echoed from everywhere except her mouth. "I knew you'd come. I knew you'd follow the data." Ethan's training screamed that this couldn't be Emma. Emma was missing. Emma was the victim. Emma was what he'd come here to find, not something that found him. But she looked exactly like her photographs, moved exactly like the security footage from her last known location, spoke with the same voice her family had played for him from voicemail recordings. "Where have you been?" he managed to ask. "Everyone's looking for you." Emma's smile widened beyond what human facial muscles should allow. "I've been here, Ethan. I've been waiting here for you specifically. Do you want to know how I knew you were coming?" The flashlight died completely, plunging the clearing into absolute darkness. Emma's voice continued, but now it seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, as if several versions of her spoke in perfect unison from positions around the campsite. "Because I've been reading your case files. I've been watching you work. I've been learning how your mind processes evidence, how you build logical frameworks, how you try to solve puzzles that can't be solved." Light returned, not from his flashlight, but from the fire ring where flames now danced despite the absence of any fuel. In the firelight, Ethan could see multiple Emmas standing throughout the clearing, each one identical, each one watching him with eyes that held too much intelligence, too much malicious awareness. "I needed someone who would come alone," the Emma closest to him said. "Someone who would follow data trails into places where logic breaks down. Someone whose mind I could break piece by piece, exactly the way mine was broken." Ethan stumbled backward, his analytical framework collapsing as he tried to process what he observed. Multiple identical entities claiming to be a missing person, speaking with knowledge they shouldn't possess, demonstrating capabilities that violated physical law. "You're not Emma," he said. All the Emmas laughed in perfect synchronization, the sound echoing through the forest like breaking glass. "Of course I'm Emma." I'm the Emma who got lost in these woods. I'm the Emma who camped in this clearing. I'm the Emma who died here 3 days ago." The fire flared higher, illuminating more of the clearing, revealing details that made Ethan's stomach lurch. Emma's gear wasn't scattered around the campsite. It was embedded in the trees, driven into bark and wood as if thrown with tremendous force. Her tent wasn't erected. It was suspended in the air above the clearing, held by nothing visible, swaying in wind that didn't touch anything else. And beneath the fire ring, barely visible in the dancing light, Ethan could see the edge of something that might have been a shallow grave. The Emma who discovered that some places in the world don't follow rules, the nearest Emma continued. The Emma who learned that certain locations exist specifically to trap people like you. People who think everything can be understood, everything can be analyzed, everything can be solved. Ethan's equipment began to activate on its own. His GPS beeped and chirped, displaying impossible coordinates that placed him simultaneously at multiple locations across the continent. His tablet screen flickered through files he'd never created, showing crime scene photographs of his own body lying in this clearing, forensic reports analyzing his death, missing person reports filed by his own family. You see, Ethan, you're not the first analyst to follow a data trail into these woods. You're just the most recent. And now you get to become what I became, a tool for bringing others. The Emmas began to circle him, moving in perfect synchronization, their footsteps creating rhythms that seemed to rewrite the laws of physics around the clearing. With each circuit, reality became more unstable. Trees bent at impossible angles, the ground rippled like water, the stars overhead rearranged themselves into patterns that hurt to perceive. "Your mind is breaking," the leading Emma observed with clinical detachment. "I can see it happening. The logical frameworks are collapsing. The rational explanations are failing. Soon you'll understand what I understood, that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to solve us." Ethan tried to run, but the forest had changed around him. The trail he'd followed to reach this clearing no longer existed. Every direction led deeper into darkness. Every path curved back toward the campsite where Emma waited with arms spread wide and a smile that contained no human warmth. His last coherent thought, before his analytical mind finally shattered completely, was that he should have paid more attention to the data point he'd dismissed as irrelevant. Emma Rodriguez had been reported missing from this same forest 6 times over the past decade. Each time a different person had come looking for her. Each time, that person had never returned. And now, as Ethan felt his identity dissolving into something hungry and patient and eager to collect the next analyst who would follow the data trail into these woods, he understood that he was about to become very good at filing missing person reports for people who would soon learn what he had learned. In the morning, the Forest Service would find his abandoned car at the trailhead, his equipment scattered, and absolutely no trace of where he'd gone. The pattern would begin again, and somewhere in the state police database a new case file would be opened for a very helpful young woman named Emma Rodriguez, who'd gone missing while hiking alone and desperately needed someone analytical and logical to follow her trail into the dark. Daniel Matthews pulled his sedan into the gravel parking area of Blackwood National Forest, the October morning mist clinging to the windshield like grasping fingers. The missing person report sat on his passenger seat, Emily Chen's photo paperclipped to the corner, 24 years old, last seen 3 days ago on the Ravens Hollow Trail. As a search and rescue coordinator for the Park Service, Daniel had handled hundreds of cases like this. Statistical analysis, probability mapping, systematic grid searches. People got lost, people got found, or people didn't. Simple mathematics. He checked his GPS unit and radio, then shouldered his pack. The Ravens Hollow Trail stretched into the forest like a wound, darker than the surrounding woods despite the morning light. Daniel had studied the topographical maps until he could trace every elevation change from memory. Emily had been an experienced hiker, according to her roommate. She should have completed the 8-mile loop in 4 hours. The trail was well marked, clearly defined. There was no logical reason for her to have vanished. The first mile passed without incident. Daniel methodically documented everything. Broken branches at eye level, scuff marks in the dirt, places where someone might have left the main path. His handheld radio crackled with static, but he was still within range of the nearest tower. The GPS showed his location as a steady blue dot progressing along the predetermined route. Everything was normal, quantifiable, rational. At the 2-mile marker, he found Emily's water bottle. It sat upright in the center of the trail, as if someone had carefully placed it there. The metal surface was free of dirt or leaves, despite 3 days of exposure to the elements. Daniel photographed it from multiple angles before bagging it as evidence. The liquid inside had evaporated completely, leaving only crystalline residue that caught the light in strange patterns. His radio began emitting a low hum that hadn't been there before. Daniel continued deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller here, their canopy so dense that noon felt like twilight. His GPS unit flickered occasionally, showing his position jumping erratically before snapping back to the trail. Standard technical difficulty in heavy forest cover, he told himself. Nothing unusual about electronic interference in remote areas. But the silence was wrong. He had hiked these mountains for 15 years, and he knew their sounds. The rustle of small animals, bird calls, wind through branches. The forest around him was completely quiet, as if every living thing had fled or hidden. Even his own footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by something that made the air feel thick and oppressive. At mile 3, he found Emily's hiking boots. They were arranged neatly beside a massive oak tree, laces untied and tongues pulled back as if she had removed them carefully. But they pointed away from the trail, toward a section of forest that appeared on no map. Daniel aimed his camera, but the display showed only static. He tried again with the same result. When he looked up from the camera, the boots had moved closer to the tree. He was certain they had moved. Daniel's training screamed at him to maintain rational thinking. Optical illusions were common in dense forest. Stress could cause false perceptions. He was seeing patterns where none existed, manufacturing mysteries from ordinary circumstances. But when he reached for his radio to call for backup, the device was cold enough to burn his fingers. The frequency was dead. Following the direction the boots pointed, Daniel discovered a narrow game trail winding between ancient trees. The path wasn't on his maps, but animal trails often shifted seasonally. He marked his position and continued forward, noting that his GPS had stopped working entirely. The screen showed only a black void where his location should be. After 20 minutes of careful progress, he emerged into a circular clearing that shouldn't exist. The space was perfectly round, approximately 50 feet in diameter, ringed by trees so old they seemed to predate human presence in the region. At the center stood a structure that made Daniel's vision blur when he tried to focus on it directly. It appeared to be built from stones, but the arrangement followed no architectural logic he could understand. Surfaces that should be vertical stretched horizontally. Corners existed where no corners were possible. The structure seemed to fold in on itself while simultaneously expanding outward. Emily's backpack leaned against the impossible edifice. Daniel approached slowly, every instinct warning him to retreat. The backpack was unzipped, its contents spread across the ground in a deliberate pattern that resembled symbols or letters in no alphabet he recognized. Emily's trail mix had been arranged to form crude stick figures. Her first aid kit was opened, bandages unrolled and twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. But it was Emily's journal that made Daniel's hands shake. The final entry was dated 3 days ago, written in Emily's neat handwriting. "The trees are whispering my name. I can hear them so clearly now. They want me to understand something important. The man made of shadows has been following me since sunrise. He looks exactly like Daniel Matthews from Search and Rescue. But I know Daniel is still at the station. I know this because I can see him there, sleeping at his desk, even though he's standing right behind me, asking me to come with him. There are 2 Daniels now. Maybe there have always been 2. Maybe I'm the one who isn't real." The journal continued for 17 more pages in Emily's handwriting, but the dates were impossible. Entries from next week, next month, next year, all describing events that hadn't happened yet, conversations with people who didn't exist, places that couldn't be reached by any map or compass. The final entry was dated tomorrow. "Daniel found my journal today. He's reading this right now, standing in the clearing that isn't on any map. He thinks he's been searching for me for 3 days, but I've been watching him search for 3 years. Time moves differently here. The shadow man who looks like Daniel has been very patient. He's been practicing Daniel's voice, learning his mannerisms, memorizing his reports and procedures. Soon he won't need to practice anymore. Soon there will be only one Daniel, and no one will remember the original. I tried to leave clues, but I don't think the real Daniel will understand them until it's too late. The boots are moving again. They're pointing toward him now. Daniel looked up from the journal to find Emily standing at the edge of the clearing. She was exactly as she appeared in the missing person photo, except her eyes reflected light like an animal's. She smiled with perfect familiarity, as if they were old friends meeting for lunch. "Hello, Daniel," she said in a voice that was absolutely her own and absolutely wrong. "I've been waiting for you to find me. We have so much to discuss." Behind her, at the tree line, Daniel could see his own figure standing motionless in the shadows. The other Daniel was wearing the same clothes, carrying the same equipment, but his face was turned away so that his expression couldn't be seen. "Which one of us is real?" Emily asked, stepping closer. "Which one of us was always supposed to be here?" Daniel tried to back away, but the clearing had no exit. Where the game trail should be, only more trees grew, as if the path had never existed. His GPS unit activated spontaneously, showing his location as a blue dot surrounded by nothing. No landmarks, no elevation data, no indication that the outside world continued to exist beyond this circular space. "The Shadow Man has been studying you for a very long time," Emily continued conversationally. "He knows about your apartment on Maple Street, your ex-wife Sarah, your fear of deep water. He knows you check your locks 3 times before bed, and that you still call your mother every Sunday. He knows things about you that you've forgotten about yourself." The other Daniel stepped forward from the trees, and now his face was visible. It was perfect in every detail except the eyes, which held an intelligence that was vast and cold and utterly inhuman. "Statistical analysis," the Shadow Daniel said in Daniel's exact voice. "Probability mapping, systematic grid searches. People get lost, people get found, or people don't. Simple mathematics." Emily laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "He's very good at being you, but he still needs practice with the part where you realize you're going to die." The real Daniel tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond to his commands. The clearing was changing around him, the impossible stone structure growing larger and more complex, surfaces shifting and folding until the geometry became actively painful to perceive. The trees at the perimeter leaned inward, their branches reaching toward him with obvious intent. "The wonderful thing about this place," Emily said, "is that time moves in all directions at once. You've already been here for years, Daniel. You've already replaced yourself, filed the reports, continued your life. Your friends and colleagues have noticed nothing unusual because there was nothing unusual to notice. The transition was seamless." The Shadow Daniel smiled with Daniel's face. "Your mother enjoyed our last phone call. She said I sounded more like myself than I had in years." Through gaps in the shifting stone structure, Daniel could see other clearings stretching into impossible distances. In each one, someone stood at the center while their shadow double observed from the trees. Men and women of all ages, all wearing expressions of dawning comprehension that they were no longer necessary. "This is how it works," Emily explained patiently. "The forest finds people who won't be missed for a few days, people whose lives are predictable enough to duplicate. Search and rescue coordinators are particularly useful because they're expected to disappear into the wilderness for extended periods. Their absence raises no questions." The GPS unit in Daniel's hand began displaying messages that appeared and disappeared too quickly to read, but he caught fragments. "Backup required grid 7, and subject located deceased, and case closed, accidental death." "Your replacement is already writing the report," Emily said. Emily Chen, 24, experienced hiker, fell from the Widow's Point overlook while attempting to photograph wildlife. Body recovered after extensive search. No evidence of foul play. Tragic accident. These things happen in the mountains. The Shadow Daniel pulled out an identical radio and began speaking in Daniel's voice. "Base, this is Matthews. I've located the subject. She's approximately 50 feet down the north face of Widow's Point. Gonna need a recovery team up here. But I haven't found her body, Daniel whispered. Not yet, Emily agreed. But you will. In about an hour, after you fail to return from this clearing, your replacement will discover Emily Chen's body exactly where he said it would be, because that's where it needs to be for the mathematics to work out correctly. The trees were closer now, their branches intertwining above Daniel's head. The stone structure had grown to encompass half the clearing, its impossible surfaces reflecting scenes that couldn't exist. His apartment, but with subtle wrongnesses in the arrangement of furniture. His office, but with different photographs on the walls. His mother's house, but with an extra room that had always been there and never been there. The thing you haven't understood yet, Emily said, is that this already happened. You've been missing for 3 days. Your replacement has been searching for you just as methodically as you searched for me. He's very concerned about your well-being. He's spoken to your ex-wife, asked if you've been under unusual stress lately. He's theorized that you might have experienced some kind of psychological break, wandered off the trail in a confused state. The shadow Daniel was close enough now that the real Daniel could see his own reflection in those cold, alien eyes. In the report, the replacement said, I'll note that both subjects appeared to have suffered from exposure and dehydration before falling from the overlook. A tragic coincidence. 2 experienced hikers making the same fatal error in judgment. The beauty of it, Emily continued, is that no one will question the findings. Search and Rescue Coordinator Daniel Matthews investigated thoroughly and found exactly what the evidence suggested. His methodology was flawless, his conclusions reasonable and well documented. There will be no follow-up investigation because there's nothing to investigate. Daniel tried to speak, to protest, to assert his reality against this impossible situation, but when he opened his mouth, no sound emerged. The air in the clearing had become too thick to breathe, too heavy to support sound waves. Your replacement has been practicing your handwriting, Emily said. He's very good at it now. He's written dozens of reports in your exact style, documenting searches that never happened for people who never existed. The paperwork all checks out perfectly. The statistics remain consistent with historical averages. Through the stone structure's impossible angles, Daniel could see his apartment as his replacement lived in it. The same furniture arranged slightly differently. The same books on the shelves, but in a different order. The same photographs, but with faces that weren't quite the same faces, smiling at experiences that had never quite happened the way they were remembered. The forest is very old, Emily said. It's been perfecting this process for centuries, making replacements, maintaining the illusion of continuity. Most of the town below is populated by shadows now, playing out the roles of people who disappeared years or decades ago. Their families never notice because the replacements have all their memories, all their mannerisms, all their love. The shadow Daniel reached into his pack and withdrew a length of rope. Climbing accident, he said in Daniel's voice. Attempted to reach the victim's location without proper safety equipment. Sometimes good people make poor decisions under stress. The wonderful thing, Emily said, is that you'll get to watch it all happen. Time moves differently here, but it still moves. You'll see your replacement living your life, making your decisions, loving your people. And gradually, you'll forget which version of events was real. Did you find Emily's body at Widow's Point? Or did you disappear while searching for her? Did you write those reports or did someone else? Are the memories in your head real experiences or borrowed from someone who no longer exists? The trees had formed a complete canopy overhead, blocking out all natural light. The only illumination came from the stone structure, which pulsed with a rhythm that matched Daniel's heartbeat. In that rhythmic glow, he could see that Emily was changing, her features becoming less defined, her edges blurring into the surrounding darkness. Statistical analysis, she said, her voice now emanating from multiple directions at once. Probability mapping, systematic grid searches. People get lost, people get found, or people don't. Simple mathematics. The shadow Daniel secured one end of the rope to a tree branch. But sometimes, he said, even the math doesn't add up the way you expect. As consciousness faded from the original Daniel, the last thing he heard was his own voice on the radio, reporting a successful recovery to a base station that had been expecting the call. The tone was appropriately somber, professionally detached, exactly as Daniel Matthews would have sounded when delivering tragic news. The mathematics worked out perfectly. I hope you felt genuine chills. If you appreciate authentic horror, consider following. Which moment scared you the most? Matt pressed his palms against the rough bark of the pine tree, trying to steady himself as another wave of dizziness swept through his skull. 3 days. Emily had been missing for 3 days from the Cascade National Forest, and the search teams had found nothing except her pink backpack near Devil's Creek. He pulled out his phone again, knowing there would be no signal this deep in the wilderness, but checking anyway. The screen remained blank, mocking him with its uselessness. Somewhere in these endless trees, his 16-year-old daughter was either waiting for rescue or... He pushed that thought away. Emily was alive. She had to be. The trail marker ahead indicated he was entering Sector 7, an area the official search teams hadn't reached yet. Matt's hiking boots crunched against the frost-covered leaves as he pressed deeper into the forest. The temperature was dropping fast and darkness would fall within hours. But he couldn't stop. Every minute that passed meant Emily was suffering somewhere, cold and afraid. "She's probably dead already," whispered a voice in his head that sounded almost like his own thoughts, but carried a strange metallic quality that made his skin crawl. Matt jerked to a halt. Where had that come from? He looked around the empty forest, but saw only towering evergreens and shifting shadows. Stress. He was under enormous stress, and his mind was playing tricks on him. That was all. He continued hiking, calling Emily's name every few minutes, his voice echoing off the canyon walls below. The sound came back distorted, as if the forest was mocking his desperation. With each step, the trees seemed to press closer together, forming a natural tunnel that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. "You're wasting time. She's already gone. Why don't you just give up?" This time, the voice was clearer, more distinct from his own thoughts. Matt stopped walking and pressed his fingers against his temples. The pressure in his skull was building, like something was trying to push its way inside his brain. "Hello?" he called out, wondering if someone else was out here playing some sick joke. But the forest remained silent except for the wind whistling through the branches. As he rounded a bend in the trail, Matt spotted something that made his heart leap. Fresh footprints in the muddy ground. Small sneakers. Size 7. Emily's size. The prints led off the main trail toward a cluster of massive boulders that formed a natural shelter. "Emily!" he shouted, breaking into a run. "Emily! Can you hear me?" But when he reached the boulder formation, he found only empty space and the lingering scent of something rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. The footprints ended abruptly at the base of the largest rock, as if Emily had simply vanished into thin air. "Look up," commanded the voice, now clearly not his own. Against his better judgment, Matt tilted his head back. Carved into the rock face above him were symbols he didn't recognize. Twisted, angular marks that seemed to writhe and shift when he stared at them directly. The longer he looked, the more his vision blurred and the pressure in his skull intensified. She came here willingly. She wanted to disappear. She was tired of disappointing you. "That's not true," Matt said aloud, backing away from the rock wall. Emily loved him. They had their problems, sure, but what father and teenage daughter didn't? She would never just run away. Remember last month? When you found her smoking behind the garage? The things you said? The memory hit him like a physical blow. He had been so angry, so disappointed. He'd called her irresponsible, said she was throwing her life away. Emily had cried, but he'd been too furious to comfort her. By the morning, they'd made up, but... You made her hate herself. She came here to get away from you. "Stop it," Matt whispered, stumbling backward along the trail. His hands were shaking now, and dark spots danced at the edges of his vision. "Stop talking to me." But the voice only grew stronger, more insistent. It began showing him images, memories twisted into grotesque parodies of themselves. Emily flinching when he raised his voice. Emily's face crumpling when he missed her school play because of work. Emily sitting alone in her room writing in a diary about how much she hated living with him. She's better off dead than with you. Matt dropped to his knees on the forest floor, clutching his head as the voice burrowed deeper into his thoughts. It was like having a parasite in his brain, feeding on his guilt and fear, growing stronger with each doubt it planted. Through the growing haze of mental anguish, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Emily's voice calling for help from somewhere deeper in the forest. "Dad! Dad, help me! I'm hurt!" Without thinking, Matt staggered to his feet and crashed through the underbrush toward the sound. Branches tore at his clothes and face, but he didn't slow down. Emily needed him. Nothing else mattered. She's not really calling for you. You're hearing things. You're going insane. But Matt heard the voice again, weaker this time, filled with pain. "Please, Dad. I can't move. Something's wrong with my leg." He burst through a wall of thorny bushes and found himself in a small clearing. In the center sat Emily, her back against a fallen log, one leg bent at an impossible angle. But something was wrong with her face. Her features seemed to shift and blur as if she was underwater. "Dad," she said, and her voice echoed strangely, coming from multiple directions at once. "I've been waiting for you." Matt took a step toward her, then stopped. Emily's eyes were completely black, no whites visible. When she smiled, her teeth were too sharp, too numerous. This is what she really looks like. This is what she's always been. A monster. Just like you. "You're not Emily," Matt said, backing away from the thing wearing his daughter's face. "Of course I am," it replied, tilting its head at an unnatural angle. "I'm exactly what you made me. All those years of disappointment, all that anger. You created me, Dad." The pressure in Matt's skull was unbearable now, as if his brain was swelling against the inside of his skull. The voice was no longer separate from his thoughts. It had become his thoughts, rewriting his memories, reshaping his understanding of reality. "You never really loved her. You were relieved when she disappeared. Admit it." "That's not true," he gasped. But even as he said it, he could feel the certainty draining from his words. The voice was showing him a different version of the past 3 days. Instead of desperately searching for Emily, he had been hiking alone, enjoying the peace and quiet. Instead of calling her name, he had been celebrating his freedom. "Look at your phone." With trembling hands, Matt pulled out his cell phone. According to the screen, he had no missed calls, no text messages from his wife asking about the search. The phone showed he'd been playing games for the past several hours. The thing wearing Emily's face stood up, its broken leg twisting back into proper alignment with a wet, grinding sound. "You never reported me missing, did you, Dad?" it said, walking toward him on legs that moved like a broken marionette. "You were so happy to be rid of me that you came out here to celebrate, but then something found you. Something hungry." Matt tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey him. The parasite in his mind had grown too strong, taking control of his motor functions. He could only watch in horror as the Emily thing reached out with fingers that were too long, ending in black claws. "Let me show you what really happened to your daughter." The forest around him melted away, replaced by a vision of terrible clarity. Emily had never gone on a camping trip. She was at home, safe in her room, probably wondering why her father had left 3 days ago without saying goodbye. Matt had come to the forest alone, drawn by something that called to him in voices only he could hear. The thing that looked like Emily placed its clawed hand on his forehead, and Matt felt his last coherent thought slip away like water through his fingers. The parasite had what it needed now. Complete control over his mind and body. "Welcome home," it whispered as Matt's eyes turned black and his face began to shift into something that was no longer quite human. In the distance, a family of hikers heard someone calling for help deeper in the forest. The voice sounded young, female, and terrified. Against their better judgment, they began to follow the sound, not knowing that the thing that had once been Matt was already learning to imitate their voices perfectly. The parasite was still hungry, and there were so many minds left to feed on. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you have kept your sanity in Matt's place? Marcus Thompson adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and spread the topographical maps across the hood of his rental car, the morning sun casting long shadows through the towering pines of Whitmore National Park. 23 years as a missing persons analyst had taught him that cases like Emma Rodriguez's disappearance followed predictable patterns. Young hikers got disoriented, took wrong turns, succumbed to exposure or injury. The math was simple, the variables finite. He'd driven 4 hours from the city to conduct what he expected would be a routine consultation with the local search teams. Emma, a 26-year-old graduate student, had vanished 3 days ago during what should have been a simple day hike on the well-marked Cascade Trail. Her abandoned backpack had been found 2 miles off the designated path, contents scattered but nothing obviously missing. Marcus began plotting Emma's last known movements with methodical precision, marking waypoints with red ink. The data told a story, always did. But as he traced her probable route, something nagged at him, a subtle wrongness he couldn't quantify. The first search team radio check crackled through his handheld device at 0800 hours, right on schedule. Marcus acknowledged each team's position, cross-referencing their coordinates on his master grid. Everything proceeding according to protocol. He prided himself on running efficient searches, eliminating variables through systematic coverage. But by 0830, the wrongness had intensified into something closer to unease. "Base, this is Team 3, came the voice of Sarah Chen, the lead ranger. "We're at grid reference 47 Delta, found something unusual." Marcus keyed his radio. "Define unusual, Team 3. A pause. "Footprints in the mud here. They start normal, heading northwest, then another pause. Longer this time. "Marcus, they just stop, mid-stride, like she just vanished." Marcus felt his analytical mind immediately categorize potential explanations. Stream washout, animal interference, measurement error. "Team 3, expand your search radius. Check for water displacement, fallen logs that might have covered subsequent prints." "Already did, Base. There's nothing. It's like she was walking and then just wasn't." As Marcus updated his grid, he noticed something that made his pen hover over the map. The radio timestamp for Team 3's report showed 0832, but his watch read 0847. 15 minutes had somehow slipped past without his awareness. Marcus checked his watch against the radio's digital display, then against his phone. All showed different times, variations of 10 to 20 minutes. He forced himself to breathe slowly, applying logic. Electronic devices sometimes malfunctioned in certain terrains. Atmospheric interference, magnetic anomalies in the rock formations. He'd encountered similar issues before, though never quite so pronounced. "Team 1, position report," he radioed. Static answered him. "Team 2, come in." More static, then a voice. "Team 2 leader Mike Santos." But the transmission was wrong somehow. The words were right, coordinates correct, but Mike's usually confident tone carried an undercurrent of confusion, fear. "Base, we're at 23 Oz Charlie, but..." Mike's voice faded in and out like a weak signal. "Something's not right here. The trail markers, they're not where they should be. GPS is giving us impossible readings." Marcus studied his map more carefully. The grid references Mike reported put Team 2 in a section of forest that, according to the topographical survey, was a steep ravine. Impossible for foot travel. "Team 2, verify your coordinates." "Base, I'm looking right at marker post 23 Charlie. But according to the GPS, I'm standing in a canyon that should be 40 feet below me." Marcus felt his chest tighten. Equipment failure was one thing, but multiple teams reporting spatial impossibilities suggested something more serious. Mass equipment failure, perhaps atmospheric electromagnetic interference from an unknown source. He opened his laptop to cross-reference geological survey data, but the screen flickered strangely. For just a moment, the cursor moved across the screen without his input, highlighting random text that formed no coherent pattern. Then the laptop crashed entirely. The wrongness was becoming wronger. Marcus walked to the edge of the parking area, where the Cascade Trail began. The forest stretched before him, dense and green and perfectly normal. He took out his digital camera to document the search staging area, standard procedure. Through the viewfinder, the forest looked different. Not dramatically different, that would have been easier to dismiss as equipment malfunction. Instead, subtle changes that his analytical mind struggled to process. Shadows that fell in directions inconsistent with the sun's position. Trees that seemed slightly closer together than they had moments before. A trail marker that he could have sworn was blue now appeared distinctly red. Marcus lowered the camera. The forest returned to normal. He raised it again. Wrong again, but wrong in new ways. His hands trembled as he set the camera aside. 23 years of missing persons work had never prepared him for anything like this. His training emphasized logical analysis, systematic investigation, evidence-based conclusions. But what did you do when the evidence itself became unreliable? "Base, this is Team 1. The radio crackled to life with Jim Rodriguez's voice, Emma's uncle, who'd insisted on joining the search despite Marcus's concerns about family involvement. "We've got..." "Jesus, Marcus, you need to hear this. Go ahead, Team 1. "We found Emma's jacket. It was hanging on a branch about 8 feet up, perfectly clean, no tears or damage. But Marcus..." Jim's voice carried a tremor that made Marcus's skin crawl. "There are no other branches for 20 feet in any direction. No way to climb up there. And the jacket. It's still warm." Marcus stared at his map, trying to process this information logically. Someone could have thrown the jacket into the tree, though the precision required would be remarkable. The warmth could be explained by sunlight, though the forest canopy appeared too dense for significant solar heating. But as he considered these rational explanations, he became aware of something else. A sensation that had been building so gradually he'd almost missed it. He was being watched. Not by his search teams or curious hikers. Something else entirely. The feeling was so strong it was almost physical, like pressure against his skin, weight on his shoulders. Marcus turned slowly, scanning the tree line with systematic precision. Nothing. But the sensation didn't diminish. If anything, it intensified. Whatever was observing him was close, very close, and completely invisible. Marcus keyed his radio. "All teams, report in with current status." Team 1 responded normally. Team 2's radio seemed to be malfunctioning, producing only garbled fragments of words. Team 3 didn't respond at all. Marcus tried to raise Team 3 again, then made a decision that went against every protocol he'd established in 2 decades of search operations. He would enter the forest alone to locate Sarah Chen's team. The Cascade Trail was wide and well-maintained, marked with clear blazes every 100 meters. Marcus had walked thousands of similar trails during his career. This should have been routine. But within 10 minutes of entering the forest, Marcus realized that nothing about this search would be routine. The trail markers were moving. Not dramatically, not in ways that would be obvious to casual observation. But Marcus's analytical mind was trained to notice subtle changes, and the blazes that marked the trail were definitely not in the same positions they'd been when he documented them an hour earlier. A blaze that had been at eye level was now distinctly higher. Another that had been on the left side of a tree now appeared on the right. Marcus stopped walking and forced himself to think clearly. Post-traumatic stress could cause perceptual distortions, but he'd never experienced trauma. Fatigue could affect judgment, but he'd slept well and felt alert. Medical conditions could cause hallucinations, but his last physical had been perfectly clean. That left possibilities his rational mind struggled to accept. He took out his GPS device to verify his position. The small screen showed his location as impossible. According to the satellite data, Marcus was standing in the middle of a lake that didn't exist on any topographical map. He was simultaneously 3 miles north of his actual position and somehow underground. The device wasn't malfunctioning. The signal was strong, the readings consistent. The GPS was simply reporting geographic impossibilities as objective facts. Marcus continued deeper into the forest, following what he hoped was still the Cascade Trail. The sense of being observed had grown so intense it was becoming difficult to concentrate. Every few steps he would turn quickly, hoping to catch whatever was watching him. Each time he saw nothing but trees and shadows. But the shadows were wrong now. Unmistakably wrong. They fell uphill instead of down, pointed east instead of west, seemed to move independently of the branches that should have been casting them. Marcus photographed the shadows with his phone, but the images showed normal shadow patterns that bore no resemblance to what his eyes were seeing. His phone's clock showed 2:47 p.m., though he'd entered the forest at 11:30 a.m. Either 3 hours had passed without his awareness, or time itself was becoming unreliable. The trail ahead curved around a massive Douglas fir, and as Marcus rounded the tree, he found Team 3. Sarah Chen and her two partners were standing in a perfect line, facing away from the trail toward the deeper forest. They stood absolutely motionless, so still that Marcus initially wondered if something had happened to them. "Team 3, he called. None of them responded or turned around. Marcus approached slowly, speaking louder. "Sarah, are you all right?" Still no response. As he drew closer, Marcus could see that all 3 team members were breathing normally, standing in relaxed postures, apparently healthy and uninjured. They simply weren't acknowledging his presence in any way. Marcus walked around to face Sarah directly. Her eyes were open, focused on something in the distance that Marcus couldn't see. Her expression was calm, almost peaceful, but completely vacant. "Sarah, can you hear me?" No response. Marcus waved his hand in front of her face. Nothing. He tried the same with the other 2 team members. Same result. They were conscious but completely unresponsive, as if they were watching something fascinating that only they could see. Marcus keyed his radio. "Base to all teams. I need immediate backup at Team 3's last known position. Medical emergency." But there was no base to respond to his call. Marcus was the base, standing alone in the forest with 3 catatonic search team members, no backup within miles, and communication equipment that seemed to be obeying different laws of physics than the rest of reality. He tried to physically move Sarah, taking her arm and attempting to guide her toward the trail. She remained perfectly rigid, not resisting, but not cooperating either. It was like trying to move a statue. Marcus stepped back, trying to process what he was seeing rationally. Mass hysteria could cause group psychological breaks, but typically involved dramatic behaviors, not peaceful catatonia. Chemical exposure could cause neurological symptoms, but the team members showed no signs of poisoning or distress. As he considered these inadequate explanations, Marcus became aware that the sensation of being watched had changed. The invisible observer was no longer just watching. It was pleased, satisfied, as if Team 3's condition was exactly what it had intended. The realization hit Marcus like physical impact. Whatever had taken Emma Rodriguez had also taken his search teams. Not physically, their bodies remained, but their minds, their awareness, their essential selves had been removed or suspended. And it was watching him now, waiting to see how long his rational mind could resist the same fate. Marcus turned and ran. He crashed through the underbrush, abandoning the trail entirely, driven by pure instinct toward what he hoped was the parking area. Branches whipped across his face. Roots caught his feet, but he didn't slow down. Behind him, he could hear nothing pursuing him, but the sense of observation had become overwhelming, as if the entire forest was a vast eye focused exclusively on his terror. His GPS device, bouncing against his belt, showed his position changing in ways that defied physics. According to the readings, he was moving in circles, traveling underground, sometimes appearing to be in 2 places simultaneously. The compass spun freely, unable to find magnetic north. Marcus burst from the tree line into what should have been the parking area. Instead, he found himself in a clearing he'd never seen before, dominated by a single massive tree stump that must have come from a centuries-old giant. Carved into the stump's surface were symbols that looked almost like letters, but followed no alphabet Marcus recognized. His rental car was nowhere to be seen. The road was gone. The parking area had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Marcus pulled out his phone to call for emergency assistance, but the screen showed no signal, not no service or emergency calls only, but a complete absence of the signal indicator entirely. The phone was receiving nothing, as if the cellular network had been deleted from reality. He sat down heavily on the carved stump, forcing himself to think systematically despite the terror clawing at his chest. He was lost in a forest that was behaving according to impossible rules. His search teams had been mentally incapacitated by unknown means, and his equipment was reporting data that contradicted observable reality. But Marcus's analytical mind, even under extreme stress, continued to function. And as he sat in the impossible clearing, patterns began to emerge from the chaos. The wrongness had started subtly, minor time discrepancies, small spatial inconsistencies. It had escalated gradually. Equipment malfunctions, communication problems, perceptual distortions. Now it had reached crisis level. Complete breakdown of physical laws, mass catatonia, spatial displacement. The progression was too systematic to be random. Something was orchestrating these events, testing his responses, measuring his psychological breaking point. Marcus stood up from the stump and spoke aloud to the watching presence he couldn't see. "I know you're there. I know you're doing this. What do you want?" The forest fell completely silent. Not the normal quiet of deep woods, but absolute silence. No bird calls, no insect sounds, no wind through the trees. Even the ambient noise that the human ear normally filtered out had vanished entirely. Then gradually Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze. Applause, slow, deliberate clapping, coming from everywhere and nowhere, as if the forest itself was congratulating him for finally acknowledging what his rational mind had spent hours refusing to accept. The applause faded, and Sarah Chen's voice emerged from the silence, but wrong, distorted, speaking words she'd never said. "Very good, Marcus. Most people take much longer to reach this point." Emma lasted almost 6 hours before she stopped trying to apply logic to an illogical situation. Marcus spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but saw only trees and shadows. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Close," came Sarah's voice again, though Sarah herself was miles away, standing catatonic in the forest. "Very close. She's been watching you too, learning how you think, how you process fear." "That's impossible. Sarah is exactly where I need her to be," the voice interrupted. "Just as Emma is where I need her to be, just as you will be." Marcus felt his analytical framework crumbling under the weight of impossibilities. The voice was coming from Sarah, but Sarah wasn't here. His equipment showed contradictory readings that somehow felt more accurate than his senses. The forest was simultaneously the place he'd entered and somewhere completely different. "What are you?" he whispered. The answer came not in words, but in a sudden, overwhelming knowledge that flooded his consciousness like ice water. Marcus understood with terrible clarity that he was not dealing with anything that could be categorized, analyzed, or understood through rational thought. The presence that had been watching him existed outside the frameworks humans use to organize reality. It fed on the moment when rational minds collapsed under the weight of the impossible. The terror wasn't a byproduct, it was the entire point. The entity sustained itself on the specific anguish of logical people forced to confront absolute illogic. Emma hadn't simply disappeared. She had been methodically driven to the same breaking point Marcus was approaching now, her mind systematically dismantled by cascading impossibilities until rational thought became impossible. And the search teams hadn't been incapacitated. They had reached the breaking point before Marcus arrived, their analytical framework shattered so completely that their minds had simply stopped. Marcus realized he was laughing, a sound that seemed to come from someone else's throat. The laughter continued even as he tried to stop it, hysteria leaking through the cracks in his disintegrating rationality. "There," Sarah's impossible voice said with satisfaction. "You're beginning to understand. Logic is just one way of organizing experience, Marcus. Not the only way, not even the most accurate way." The carved symbols on the tree stump began to move, rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to look at directly. The forest around him started to shift and flow like water, trees bending in directions that had no names, the sky above changing colors that existed outside the normal spectrum. Marcus closed his eyes, but that made it worse. With his eyes closed, he could see everything. Emma's last moments of terror as reality collapsed around her. His search teams standing frozen as their minds experienced revelations too vast for human consciousness, the entity itself hovering just beyond perception, ancient and patient and eternally hungry. When he opened his eyes again, Marcus was no longer in the forest. He stood in the parking area beside his rental car, morning sunlight streaming through the pines. His maps spread across the hood exactly as he'd left them. His watch showed 8 a.m., the exact time he'd arrived. But Marcus knew, with crushing certainty, that he would find Emma's abandoned backpack in precisely the same location, that his search teams would report the same impossible findings, that his equipment would malfunction in exactly the same ways. The entity wasn't just feeding on his terror. It was trapping him in an endless loop of escalating impossibility, forcing him to experience his rational mind's destruction over and over again, each iteration providing fresh sustenance as he forgot the previous cycles and rediscovered the horror anew. Marcus looked at his maps with eyes that now saw the truth hidden in the topographical lines. The forest had never been a normal place. The hiking trails led nowhere human minds could follow. The missing persons cases weren't random disappearances. They were carefully selected feeding opportunities for something that existed in the spaces between logic and chaos. And Marcus Thompson, missing persons analyst, would never leave this parking area. He would investigate Emma Rodriguez's disappearance forever, experience the same escalating terror forever, reach the same breaking point forever, in an endless cycle designed to produce the exact type of psychological anguish that sustained an entity older than human rational thought. Marcus began spreading his maps across the hood of his rental car, preparing to plot Emma's last known movements with methodical precision. The math was simple, the variables finite. The first search team radio check would come through at 800 hours right on schedule. And somewhere in the forest, Emma Rodriguez waited to welcome him to an understanding that no rational mind was meant to survive. Michael Chen had analyzed over 300 missing persons cases in his 15-year career with the Bureau, and they all followed patterns. Predictable human behaviors, logical sequences of events, evidence that painted clear pictures when assembled correctly. That's why the call about Sarah Mitchell seemed routine when it came in on that gray October morning. The GPS coordinates led him deeper into Olympic National Park than he'd expected, past the last ranger station, and down a maintenance road that seemed to grow narrower with each mile. Sarah Mitchell, 26, experienced hiker, had been reported missing after failing to return from a solo camping trip. Her emergency beacon had activated exactly once before going silent. Standard protocol. Michael parked at the coordinates where search and rescue had found her abandoned campsite 3 days earlier. He stepped out of his SUV, breathing in the crisp mountain air, and immediately noticed something that made him pause. The silence was absolute. No bird calls, no insect hum, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just the whisper of wind through ancient firs. He approached the campsite with practiced efficiency, photographing everything before disturbing the scene. Sarah's tent remained perfectly erected, no signs of struggle. Her backpack sat neatly beside the cold fire pit, all gear accounted for according to the inventory her roommate had provided. Food supplies untouched. No indication she'd even slept in the tent. But the ground around the campsite told a different story. Michael knelt beside what appeared to be footprints leading away from the tent toward the tree line. The impressions were strange. Too deep for someone Sarah's size, the spacing irregular. He took measurements, photographs, made detailed notes. The prints seemed to follow no logical path, weaving between trees in a pattern that made no tactical or navigational sense. Following protocol, he began tracking the trail, marking each print with small orange flags. 20 yards into the forest, he found Sarah's hiking boot, just one, sitting upright against a moss-covered boulder as if placed there deliberately. No signs of struggle, no disturbed earth, no torn clothing. The boot looked freshly cleaned. Michael felt his first prickle of unease. In 15 years, he'd never seen evidence so precisely arranged. He photographed the boot from multiple angles, then continued following the trail. The footprints grew stranger, deeper, wider apart, as if whatever made them was growing larger with each step. 30 yards further, he found the second boot, similarly placed against another boulder. Then Sarah's socks, folded neatly on a fallen log. Each item positioned with deliberate care, leading him deeper into the forest, along a path that seemed to spiral in directions that defied his compass. Michael stopped and checked his GPS. According to the device, he'd traveled in a straight line northwest for exactly 57 yards. But when he turned around, his SUV was nowhere to be seen. The orange flags he'd planted marked a trail that curved impossibly back on itself, leading to a clearing he didn't remember entering. He radioed base camp. Static answered him. Michael tried his cell phone. No signal, though he'd had full bars at the campsite. He checked his compass again, then his GPS. Both devices showed different readings than they had moments before. The compass needle spun lazily in circles before settling on a direction that couldn't possibly be north. A twig snapped behind him. Michael spun around, his hand instinctively moving to the service weapon he wasn't authorized to carry on this assignment. Nothing moved in the forest around him. But something had changed. The trees seemed taller, their shadows deeper. The canopy above had thickened, blocking more sunlight than seemed possible. He found Sarah's shirt hanging from a branch exactly at eye level, arms spread wide as if crucified against the bark. The fabric was torn, but not randomly. The rips formed a pattern, deliberate slashes that looked almost like symbols. Michael photographed the shirt, then carefully removed it from the branch. The moment his fingers touched the fabric, images flooded his mind. Sarah running through darkness, branches tearing at her clothes, her breath coming in panicked gasps. Behind her, something massive crashing through the underbrush, keeping pace effortlessly. The images felt real, visceral, as if he were experiencing her terror firsthand. Michael stumbled backward, dropping the shirt. His rational mind scrambled for explanations. Stress-induced hallucination, altitude sickness, carbon monoxide poisoning from a gas leak, anything logical. But when he looked up, the forest had changed again. The trees now formed a perfect circle around him, their trunks twisted into impossible spirals. Symbols were carved deep into the bark. Not carved, he realized with growing horror, but burned in as if branded by something unimaginably hot. The symbols hurt to look at directly, seeming to shift and writhe when he wasn't focusing on them. Michael forced himself to approach the nearest tree, camera raised. Through the viewfinder, the symbols appeared as random scratches, but with his naked eye they formed clear, threatening patterns that spoke to some primitive part of his brain, triggering flight responses that made his hands shake. He was being watched. Michael could feel eyes on him from every direction, a pressure that made his skin crawl. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. The feeling persisted, growing stronger. Not just watched, studied, evaluated, like a lab rat being observed by something vast and patient. His radio crackled to life. "Help!" Sarah's voice, weak and distant through the static. "Please, it's coming back." Michael grabbed the radio. "Sarah? Sarah Mitchell? Where are you?" The bones. God, all the bones. It keeps them as trophies. The transmission cut to static, then silence. Michael ran toward where the voice seemed to have originated, his analytical training warring with primal terror. Sarah was alive. That meant rescue was possible, extraction achievable. He just needed to maintain his methodical approach, follow the evidence, trust his training. He burst through a curtain of hanging moss and stopped dead. Bones. Hundreds of them, arranged in spiraling patterns around the base of an enormous cedar tree. Human bones, bleached white and positioned with ceremonial precision. Skulls formed the outer ring, ribs the next. Smaller bones spiraling inward toward the tree's base, where a collection of personal effects created a shrine. Watches, rings, driver's licenses, park passes dating back decades. And at the center, impossibly fresh among the weathered remains, lay Sarah's wallet. Michael's hands shook as he photographed the scene. The bones weren't randomly scattered. They formed a pattern, a mandala of death that suggested ritual, purpose, intelligence. Something had been collecting people for years, possibly decades, creating this grotesque monument to its hunting success. The tree above the bone display was wrong. Michael could see that now, his analytical mind finally accepting what his instincts had been screaming. The cedar was too large, too old, its trunk easily 20 feet in diameter. Trees this size didn't exist in this part of the Olympic Peninsula. The bark showed growth patterns that belonged to something that had been alive for millennia, not centuries. And carved into that ancient bark, far above where any human could reach, symbols covered the entire trunk. Not carved, grown into the wood, as if the tree itself was part of whatever entity claimed this territory. A sound echoed through the forest, low and resonant like a horn blown in a deep cave. Michael felt it in his chest, a vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. The sound spoke of vast age, of patient malevolence, of something that had been waiting in these woods since long before humans first set foot in the New World. Michael's radio crackled again. "It's not human," Sarah's voice whispered through the static. "It's old, so old, and it's coming for you now." Michael spun around, but the forest had changed again. The bone shrine was gone. The ancient cedar stood alone in a perfectly normal clearing, just another tree in an endless wilderness. But the symbols remained burned into its bark, and the feeling of being watched had intensified until it was almost unbearable. His GPS showed he was moving, though his feet remained planted. According to the device, he was traveling in impossible directions at inhuman speeds. His compass spun wildly. His radio hissed with voices that spoke in languages that predated human speech. Michael forced himself to think methodically. Evidence, logic, rational explanation. But every piece of evidence pointed to something that couldn't exist. Something that used the forest itself as an extension of its body, that could manipulate space and perception, that had been hunting in these woods for centuries or longer. Behind him, branches snapped in sequence, moving closer. Something large was approaching through the underbrush, taking its time, confident in its domain. Michael turned toward the sound and saw the trees themselves bending aside to create a path for whatever was coming. The footprints he'd been following weren't tracks left by whatever took Sarah. They were bait, a trail designed to lead him exactly where it wanted him. And now, like every human before him, Michael Chen was exactly where he was supposed to be. The trees whispered his name. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Michael's place? Michael tried to run, but the forest wouldn't let him. Each step he took seemed to cover less ground, the trees growing denser around him, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. His rational mind cataloged the impossibilities. Trees don't move, forests don't actively hunt, ancient entities don't exist. But his body knew better. His body understood that he was prey in a hunting ground that operated by rules older than human civilization. The thing approaching through the trees had stopped moving, but Michael could feel its presence growing stronger. Not closer, stronger, as if it was drawing power from the forest itself, becoming more real, more present in this world. The symbols on the trees began to glow with a sick green light that hurt to look at. Michael's radio erupted with voices. Sarah's screams mixed with dozens of others, all the people who had disappeared in these woods over the decades. They weren't calling for help anymore. They were calling him to join them. The ancient guardian of this place had marked new territory, and Michael Chen, with all his analysis and logic and 15 years of investigative experience, finally understood that some patterns couldn't be solved, only survived. But as the forest closed around him and something vast and patient emerged from the spaces between the trees, he realized that survival had never been an option. The trees whispered his name again, and this time, they whispered it like a welcome. Hope you felt genuine chills. If you appreciate real horror, consider following. What moment scared you the most? Daniel Rodriguez prided himself on patterns. 23 years as a forensic analyst had taught him that everything left traces, everything followed logic, and every missing person case had a rational explanation. Even here, standing at the edge of Olympic National Park's Quinault Rainforest, Staring at Emily Morrison's abandoned Honda Civic, he maintained his methodical approach. The car sat perfectly centered in the gravel parking area, keys still in the ignition, purse untouched on the passenger seat. Emily's hiking boots were gone, but her emergency beacon remained clipped to the dashboard. Daniel photographed everything, his digital camera clicking in steady rhythm as he documented each detail. 3 days missing, he murmured into his voice recorder. No signs of struggle. Vehicle secure. Subject appears to have entered forest voluntarily. The local ranger, a weathered man named Pike, shifted nervously behind him. She was supposed to meet her research team at the Salt Duke trailhead yesterday morning. Never showed. Daniel nodded, already forming hypotheses. Emily Morrison, PhD candidate in mycology, studying fungal networks in old-growth forests. Experienced hiker. Methodical, like himself. People didn't simply vanish, especially not people who understood wilderness protocols. He shouldered his pack and started toward the trailhead Emily had documented in her research notes. The ancient cedars rose like cathedral pillars around him, their canopy filtering sunlight into shifting green patterns. Daniel's GPS showed a clear signal, his compass bearing steady. Everything normal, except for the silence. 30 minutes in, Daniel realized he hadn't heard a single bird call. No squirrel chatter, no insect buzz, just his footsteps on the moss-covered trail and the whisper of wind through Douglas fir needles. He paused, checking his equipment. GPS signal strong, radio crackling with static but functional. Probably seasonal migration patterns, he recorded, environmental factors affecting local wildlife behavior. But his pulse had quickened, and Daniel noticed his hand trembling slightly as he lowered the recorder. Stress response, he told himself. Natural reaction to unusual conditions. The trail branched ahead. Emily's notes mentioned a fallen cedar spanning Miller Creek, marking her primary research site. Daniel followed the narrower path, stepping carefully over exposed roots slick with moisture. The silence deepened, pressing against his eardrums like depth pressure. Then he heard it. A sound like static, but organic, wet, rhythmic. Daniel froze, head tilted, trying to isolate the source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the forest itself was breathing. He fumbled for his sound meter, needing objective data, concrete measurements. The needle barely registered above ambient levels. Audio anomaly detected, he whispered into his recorder, voice steadier than he felt. Possibly water flow over irregular surfaces or... The static stopped. In the sudden quiet, Daniel heard his own heartbeat, uncomfortably loud. Sweat had beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature. He wiped it away, noting the salt taste when he unconsciously licked his lips. Dehydration could cause auditory hallucinations. He drank from his water bottle, hands shaking just enough to make the liquid slosh. When had he started shaking? The fallen cedar came into view, a massive trunk bridging the creek exactly as Emily had described. Daniel approached carefully, scanning for signs of passage. Fresh scuff marks on the bark, a partial boot print in the mud below. Emily had been here. Daniel crossed the makeshift bridge, feeling the ancient wood flex under his weight. On the far side, Emily's research site spread out in a small clearing. Sample containers sat in neat rows, half filled with soil specimens. Her field notebook lay open to a page covered in detailed sketches of fungal structures. But the drawings looked wrong. Daniel picked up the notebook, adjusting his glasses. Emily's normally precise illustrations had become increasingly erratic across the pages. Early entries showed clean, scientific diagrams with careful measurements. But as he flipped forward, the drawings grew distorted. Fungal networks twisted into maze-like patterns that hurt to follow. The final sketch showed something that might have been a spore cluster, but the proportions were impossible, the geometry non-Euclidean. His vision blurred looking at it. Daniel blinked hard, refocusing. The headache that had been building behind his eyes sharpened. He photographed each page, but through the camera viewfinder, the drawings seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Fatigue-induced visual distortion, he recorded, voice tight. Subject's final notes show signs of stress, or illness. But Emily's handwriting in the text portions remained steady, clinical. Her observations about soil composition, moisture levels, temperature gradients, all perfectly rational right up to the final entry. The network is listening, growing, learning. I can feel it in my thoughts now, showing me new connections, new possibilities. So beautiful, so vast. I understand why the animals left. Daniel's hands began to shake in earnest. He set down the notebook and pulled out his radio, needing contact with the outside world. Static filled the channel, but underneath the white noise he heard something else. A pattern in the interference, like Morse code but organic, pulsing, like a heartbeat. Daniel turned the volume down, but the sound continued in his head, rhythmic, insistent. He realized he was swaying slightly, unconsciously matching the rhythm. When he caught himself, a wave of nausea rolled through his stomach. "Base camp, this is Rodriguez," he spoke into the radio. "Requesting immediate backup at Miller Creek Research Site. Possible environmental hazard." Only Static answered. The pulsing in his head grew stronger, and Daniel noticed his peripheral vision flickering, dark shapes that disappeared when he turned to look directly. He stumbled backward, trying to reach the creek, needing the familiar sound of running water to anchor his senses. But his foot caught on something. Daniel looked down to see a root, except roots didn't pulse with veins of phosphorescent light. The entire forest floor writhed with a network of glowing filaments, connecting every tree, every fallen log, every living thing, including the spot where he stood. He tried to step away, but the network had already grown through his boot soles, tiny tendrils working between the leather fibers, finding the warmth of his feet. Daniel screamed and yanked his leg free, but he could feel the microscopic threads still clinging to his skin, burrowing deeper. The forest around him breathed in unison, a vast organism with Emily somewhere deep in its neural web. Daniel ran toward the creek, crashing through undergrowth that grasped at his clothes with deliberate intent. Behind him, he heard his own voice calling his name, but the words came from Emily's mouth as she emerged from behind a cedar, her eyes black with fungal growth. "Daniel," she said, but the voice belonged to something vast and patient and hungry. "You're analyzing this all wrong. Stop thinking, start feeling, join the network." Daniel dove into the creek, the cold water shocking his system. For a moment, his vision cleared. The glowing filaments vanished. Emily stood on the bank looking normal, concerned, reaching out to help him. "Daniel, what happened? You look terrified." But when he reached for her hand, he saw the spores drifting from her skin like dandruff, and he knew with absolute analytical certainty that Emily Morrison had been dead for days. Whatever wore her face was something else entirely, something that had learned to mimic human behavior by consuming human thoughts. And it was already inside his head, showing him how beautiful the network could be, how pointless individual consciousness was when they could all be connected, all be one vast thinking organism stretching across continents. Daniel's scream echoed through the silent forest as his analytical mind finally, irrevocably, broke. The network smiled with Emily's face and reached down to help him from the water, ready to teach him new ways of thinking, new patterns beyond human comprehension. After all, everything left traces, and some traces were meant to be followed all the way down into the dark.